Welcome back. Today we are talking about the CPI and the real picture of inflation and why it matters. My name is Alex. Let's go. All right, so here is today's infographic on Crypto Infographics, and it is the real picture of inflation. And we're going to be talking about four buckets. One is the one that we are all more familiar with, which is the CPI. And there are a couple other things that fall into that 0 to 2% annual inflation bucket. There's also a bucket, that inflates, at 7 to 12%. And we'll dive into what those are. And then there's the 15 to 25% range. And then there is the final special bucket. But why this matters, let's first go to Michael Saylor. He's the CEO of MicroStrategy. Put in $450 million into Bitcoin. It's now over $700 million, and they operate on a Bitcoin standard. And the reason is because he realized that his Ice Cube, his savings, his USD, his cash position was melting at a much faster rate than the CPI would indicate. So his quote here: stocks, bonds, and real estate are all fiat instruments that derive their value from the future stream of cash flows, discounted by the rate of monetary expansion and risk premium. They all fail as a store of value unless they can grow their cash flows faster than the Fed can print money. So it's really relevant for us to know, what is our inflation rate that we're experiencing? What percent of loss of purchasing power are we experiencing each year? And then we'll know what we need to aim for as a store of value to counteract that. Back to the chart. So 0 to 2%. One that's going to be at 0% is deflating products. These are things that are dematerialized by technology, things like photos, video games, anything where technology can drive the price down. Branded consumables, those are things that you might purchase at the grocery store. Michael Saylor also goes into things like manual labor, things like that. The prices there may increase around 2%. And then the CPI usually falls at around 2%. And that's an index of the price increase of a basket of goods. And I love Michael Saylor's quote. He says that, from psychology, we can't tell people what to think, but we can tell people what to think about. And so government and media has done a great job of saying, hey, when you think of inflation, think of CPI. CPI is inflation. However, the equation for for calculating the CPI changes regularly. There's an index of all the changes on the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and they systematically cherry pick things that will help keep that inflation number low. So it's like, hey, there's nothing to see here. So what's interesting is, as we move on to this second bucket, you'll see the CPI as calculated from using the 1980s method is much higher. It'd be about 9% from last, if we calculated it for last year. And that's because it used to include things like education. It used to include things like medicine. It used to include things like real estate. However, those are things that experience higher rates of inflation and are a massive purchase, and so they obviously drive the the CPI number upwards. So it's beneficial to remove those from the calculation. And actually, the calculation for the CPI is 107 pages long. It is ridiculous. There's no reason that to calculate an accurate picture of the inflation that consumers experience needs to be 107 pages long. So I'll show you a couple things here. ShadowStats is an outstanding resource, and this is the CPI if we calculated it using the 1990s CPI. And you can see it hovers around 4 to 6%. If we go back further from the 1980s based CPI calculation, we can see that it hovers between 5 and 10%. Let's go back to the chart. We'll also see that the M2 money supply tends to increase by about 7 to 12% on a good year. and this chart is readily available. We can see the money supply on a daily basis. And obviously with the pandemic happening, there's massive amounts of stimulus, and we can see that the amount of US dollars in circulation was increased by almost 25% this year. That means 1 out of every $4 was created this year. So if we go back to the chart, you'll see the M2 money supply expansion or inflation in 2020 is in this 15 to 25% bucket. And then another relevant, before we leave this second bucket, is the cost of living. I think that's what matters most to your average person. How much does it cost to live? And when you look at popular cities in the United States, the typical increase of cost of living ranges between 7 to 12% per year. All right, moving on. What experiences 15 to 25% inflation? These are things that are much scarcer. Things like luxury property, places that you would actually want to live where they are not making more real estate. That's going to inflate like quite a bit each year. We talked about the money supply this year. Michael Saylor goes into the average yield on a vanilla long bond has increased at 22% per year over the last 10 years. So the example he gave is he used to be able to get a $50,000 a year yield on a $1 million bond. Now it would take a $10 million bond to get that same yield. And if you back out those numbers, that's 22% inflation per year. And we talk about in the Bitcoin community being orange pilled. It's when your eyes are kind of opened to these sorts of facts that you don't typically hear or learn about growing up. And this podcast, when Michael Saylor goes on the Stefan Livera podcast, he pretty much orange pills everybody in a matter of 1,000 words. This is an essential listen, and he talks about what's the last bucket, the special bucket. That is Bitcoin. So if we want to talk, what's the inflation of Bitcoin's price over this entire time, it would break the normal graph. If you look at the last year, it's been over 150%. If you look over the last 5 years, it's over 200%, more like 220%. If you look over the last 10 years, it's a ridiculous amount. So when you're looking for a store of value, how to maintain your purchasing power, you have a decision to make. Where are you going to put your money? And this is pretty obvious, like where is the best place to maintain and have my purchasing power appreciate. So the question you're left with is, where are you going to put your value so that it maintains and appreciates over space and time? And I'll leave you with one more chart. This is from Plan B on Twitter. He's tremendous as far as charting Bitcoin. And this is the 200-week moving average. So it's basically a 4-year trailing average of Bitcoin's price. And the crazy thing about this, it has never decreased ever for a single week in Bitcoin's history. So zoom out and ask yourself the question, is this the place where I want to put at least some of my purchasing power? I'll leave up the infographic now for 10-20 more seconds. Take a screenshot, share it if you care to. That is the video for today. Please do leave a comment. I want to know what % per year do you feel like your purchasing power is melting and why? Drop it in the comments, and I'll see you next time.